Thank you, Phil. I knew you'd tell that story. This is was a very early example of why I knew I should stick to code rather than hardware. I do a lot of stuff on astronomical instrumentation. Right?
I, of course, have never, ever dropped or broken anything. That's part of experimentation.
Absolutely, Phil. Now I work in a stats department. And so when I'm meeting somebody, I sit next to someone on a plane or something, I say, I'm a statistician if I don't want to talk to them, because they go, oh my God, stats was my worst subject at school, right? If I do want to talk to them, I say, and can I have the clicker? There's the clicker. Can you hear me? Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Anyway, so I say I'm an astrophysicist or an astronomer, and people go, wow, what's your star sign? Anyway, so I'm not going to talk about stats and programming and stuff. I've got source on this. That's great. That's a lovely clicker covered in mayo. What I'm going to talk about is aliens. Is this going? Can you make it go? Is that the only one? Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Who has ever had SETI at home on their computer or something like that? Cool, not many people. So the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is what people call, the search for aliens, right? And so this has been why I got into science. I think you're not allowed to say that generally. You're supposed to say, I got into science because I want to measure something to another decimal place. Well, I don't care about that stuff. That's what I do every day, but I do it in order to try and find out, are we alone in the universe, right? And so the sort of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence goes back to, very nicely prepped by Robert, Los Alamos, right, in the 50s, where this New Yorker cartoon came up, right? So it turned out that rubbish bins were disappearing from the street in New York, and no one knew why. And so here was a New Yorker cartoon saying maybe it was aliens, right? I think if there were aliens doing things in New York, that would explain a lot of recent politics, right? And so anyway, they were at this table, and among them was Enrico Fermi, was his name, right? If you've seen Oppenheimer, you can imagine the sort of environment it was, and I think a lot of you have, right? And so they talked about this cartoon, and then they moved on. And then he was silent, and he was thinking, and he said, where are they? He just interjected in the conversation. Everyone knew what he meant, because he was able to calculate, right? He was able to calculate that you should be able to cross the galaxy, even if you can go at 1% of the speed of light, in much, much less time than the galaxy's been around. That is, the galaxy's 100,000 light years across. If you go at 1% of the speed of light, you can cross it in 10 million years. The galaxy's been around for 10 billion, right? And so it should have been possible, if aliens were going to colonize the galaxy, to have done so long since already, right? And so if you don't see them locally, and ask the question, why aren't they there? So this prompted the first sort of radio SETI searches using Arecibo Observatory was the really big one. This is the telescope in Puerto Rico that recently collapsed. In GoldenEye, you saw a prelude of that. For England, James, no, for me, where Trevelyan falls off the thing. Well, that was actually Arecibo is where they filmed that, right? In real life, it collapsed because of neglect by the American government and underfunding, and then it collapsed in a hurricane, just like anything else, right? And so, nevertheless, this was a really successful mission, right, to try and look for radio signals from aliens, right? And so they searched very, very deeply among a number of nearby stars, and they didn't find anything. And so this actually sort of brought up the Fermi paradox, as we call it, where we say, okay, where are they? We've actually looked now, and we still don't find anything. And so a few people thought of ideas to sharpen the Fermi paradox, to find other ways other than consciously, someone signaling us to look for aliens, right? And so we had one idea was sort of another guy that Princeton Institute of Advanced Study. I've got some callbacks to the previous talk. I didn't intend to. Who was Freeman Dyson. He's this really remarkable character who died a few years ago in COVID, right? Who never had a PhD, invented all sorts of important physics, but one of these things was the idea that we should look for aliens not because of their deliberate transmissions, but because of the transmissions they didn't know they were making or didn't, intend to be making. That is, for example, waste heat. So Sam Altman, the OpenAI guy this week said, maybe we should just, we're worried about power for data centers. Well, maybe we should turn the whole solar system into a Dyson sphere. And like this absolute idiot podcaster guy's like, yeah, man, that's really cool. Well, here's the trick, right? So a Dyson sphere, Freeman Dyson put out, was the idea that you should build a very large collecting array around a star to suck up nearly all of its light and use this for sort of powering something like computers or whatever. Very nice idea. What's really cool is it means that it's going to radiate waste heat because of all the computing. It's unavoidable, that's thermodynamics, and so you should be able to see this as an infrared excess around this star, right? Of course, you don't want Sam Altman to build one around the solar system because all that heat will be trapped in the solar system. We'll get to a thermal equilibrium in there and we won't enjoy that. We'll get too hot, right? Anyway, so we've looked pretty deeply for those and we haven't found any. So people started to think of explanations for why we haven't seen any aliens. So, there's a lot of popular science fiction. Here's a still from Mass Effect, one of my favourite games, right? That, the reason that we haven't found aliens is that there's some kind of alien, dominant race who sort of invade every planet that develops intelligence, right? Famously done in The Dark Forest, if you've seen Tse Liao's sort of recent popular book or awful television series. Anyway, look, I don't think there's any reason to think that that's true, but no reason to think it's not yet. There's a slightly nicer idea going back to New York. I used to live there for my sins. If you're in the middle of Central Park, there are lines of sight you could have where you wouldn't know you're in the largest city on a continent, right? That you could be in a very large park, even though the rest of the galaxy is very, very populated. And there's this cosmic zoo hypothesis that says that aliens might be leaving us alone deliberately, some kind of conservationist thing. And so, very hard to disprove, but it's a nice idea. We all kind of like the zoo or whatever. Then there's sort of ideas that aliens might be something completely different from anything we could imagine. And they're already around us and we've maybe even seen them. So there's a wonderful book, Fred Hoyle's The Black Cloud, about sort of a black cloud that envelops the solar system and it turns out to be conscious, right? And so that's a very nice idea. And then sort of there's this cosmic environmentalism about, maybe it wants to protect us. But actually, I think the sort of the take-home message from all the SETI studies, all of the explanations of the Fermi paradox, is that it's really actually about us and our politics, right? So the Fermi paradox comes out of a guy who was actively involved in making genocide weapons in Los Alamos, right? Now, this is the kind of environment where people are talking about, obviously you'd just destroy civilizations and obviously you'd colonize the galaxy if you could, but I think maybe not everyone would think so. In academic literature, the Fermi paradox is called the Hart-Tipler paradox, after the actual first two people who published it. Well, Michael Hart is a famous member of a KKK organization, and Frank Tipler is an extremist religious figure. And so, again, these guys don't have normal politics, right? And so, maybe we should all think about what it says about us, that we've talked so much about SETI and, all these explanations of, intergalactic war. Maybe we should really be thinking about, should scientists be involved in making genocide weapons? Anyway, on that note, thank you very much for having me.